The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the village green of St. Mary Mead as Miss Jane Marple made her way along the familiar path to Larkspur Hall. Her knitting bag swung gently at her side, containing the makings of yet another pair of mittens for the church jumble sale, though her pale blue eyes were far more occupied with observing the unusual bustle of activity surrounding the grand estate. Today marked the unveiling of the newly restored portrait of Lady Cecily Winterbourne, and the entire village had been invited to witness what Mrs. Dolly Bantry had declared would be quite the artistic event of the season. Miss Marple paused at the ornate iron gates, noting with the practiced eye of someone who had spent decades watching human nature unfold in all its complexity. The various currents of excitement and tension that seemed to ripple through the assembled guests. There was something in the air beyond the usual anticipation of a social gathering, a subtle undercurrent that reminded her of the moments before a summer storm when the very atmosphere seems to hold its breath. The drawing room at Larkspur Hall had been transformed for the occasion, with delicate arrangements of late roses adorning every available surface and the family's finest china laid out for tea. Mrs. Cordelia Rathbone, the current mistress of the hall, moved among her guests with the gracious efficiency of a woman well versed in the art of entertaining, though Miss Marple noticed the slight tremor in her hands as she adjusted the silver tea service for the third time in as many minutes. Sir Miles Rathbone stood near the French windows, his weathered face bearing the expression of a man who had faced down charging elephants in his colonial days, but found himself somewhat at sea when confronted with the intricacies of village social events. The centerpiece of the afternoon was the portrait itself, currently shrouded in pale silk and positioned on an elegant easel near the fireplace. Dr. Maurice Lake, the restoration expert who had been brought down from London at considerable expense, stood beside his handiwork with the quiet pride of a craftsman who knew his business. He was a thin, precise man with the delicate hands of someone who spent his days coaxing centuries-old pigments back to life. And Miss Marple observed the way his eyes darted occasionally toward Mrs. Rathbone with something that might have been concern or perhaps calculation. Among the assembled villagers, Miss Marple recognized the familiar faces that made up the fabric of St. Mary Mead society. There was Mrs. Price Ridley, the vicar's wife, her sharp eyes already cataloguing every detail for future discussion at the Women's Institute. Young Dr. Haydock had arrived with his medical bag, as was his custom when attending any gathering where elderly ladies might be overcome by excitement. Mrs. Emmeline Drake from the village shop stood with Colonel Brindley, both of them studying the shrouded portrait with the intensity of art critics, though Miss Marple suspected their interest lay more in the realm of gossip than aesthetics. What caught Miss Marple's particular attention, however, was the presence of Miss Tamsin Reeve, the local artist whose own work adorned half the sitting rooms in the village. There was something in the young woman's posture, a tension around her shoulders and a tightness about her mouth that suggested more than professional curiosity about Dr. Lake's restoration work. Miss Marple had noticed, with the eye for detail that came from years of observing the small dramas of village life, that Miss Reeve's fingers bore traces of paint that seemed unusually fresh for someone who claimed to have spent the morning preparing for the social event. As the moment for the unveiling approached, Dr. Lake stepped forward with the ceremonious air of a magician about to perform his greatest trick. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his cultured voice carrying easily across the expectant gathering, "it gives me great pleasure to present Lady Cecily Winterbourne, restored to her former glory after more than a century of neglect." The silk covering whispered to the floor with theatrical grace, revealing the portrait in all its restored magnificence. Lady Cecily gazed out from her gilded frame with the serene beauty that had made her famous throughout the county in her lifetime. Her dark hair was arranged in the elaborate style of the early 19th century, and her pale blue gown seemed to shimmer in the afternoon light. The artist had captured something ineffable in her expression, a quality that seemed to speak of secrets held and sorrows borne with dignity. The assembled guests murmured their appreciation, and Mrs. Rathbone stepped forward to express her gratitude to Dr. Lake for his meticulous work. It was then, as the polite applause died away and the company began to move closer for a better view, that someone gasped. Miss Marple, positioned strategically near a display of family photographs where she could observe both the portrait and the reactions of the guests, saw it almost immediately. A single, perfect tear had appeared on Lady Cecily's painted cheek. It was not, Miss Marple noted with the precision that had served her well in previous encounters with the inexplicable, a flaw in the varnish or a trick of the light. The tear was round and glistening, and as they watched in fascinated silence, it began to trace a slow path down the lady's face, following the natural contours with an almost deliberate grace. "Good heavens," breathed Mrs. Price Ridley, her voice carrying the mixture of horror and delight that accompanies the truly unexpected. "The portrait is weeping." Dr. Lake stepped forward quickly, his professional composure barely masking what Miss Marple recognized as genuine alarm. "It's merely a reaction to the change in temperature and humidity," he said with the authority of expertise, though his voice carried a note of uncertainty. Old varnishes can sometimes exude moisture under certain atmospheric conditions. But even as he spoke, the tear continued its journey, and Miss Marple observed that it seemed to possess a consistency and color that spoke of something far more substantial than condensation. There was, she noticed with the attention to detail that had become second nature, a faint metallic scent beginning to permeate the room. Subtle but unmistakable to someone who had encountered it before in circumstances far less genteel than a village art exhibition. The gathering had fallen into an uneasy silence, broken only by the soft tick of the mantelpiece clock and the distant sound of birds in the garden. It was Mrs. Rathbone who moved first, reaching toward the tea service with hands that trembled slightly as she began to pour elderflower cordial into delicate crystal glasses. "Perhaps," she said with determined cheerfulness, "we should toast Lady Cecily's return to us, regardless of any minor atmospheric peculiarities." Dr. Lake accepted the first glass with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, and Miss Marple watched with the focused attention of someone who had learned that the smallest gestures often revealed the largest truths. He raised the glass in a gesture of appreciation, took a generous sip of the sweet cordial, and then froze with an expression of the most profound surprise. The glass slipped from his fingers, shattering against the polished floor with a sound like breaking crystal bells. Dr. Lake swayed for a moment, his hand pressed to his throat, and then collapsed with a sudden finality that Miss Marple had witnessed too many times before to mistake for anything other than death. As the room erupted into chaos and Dr. Haydock rushed forward with his medical bag, Miss Marple remained perfectly still, her keen eyes moving from the fallen man to the weeping portrait, to the scattered shards of crystal, and finally to the faces of the guests, each now bearing expressions that ranged from shock to horror to something that might, in certain lights, have been relief. The portrait of Lady Cecily continued to weep, the tear now joined by others, creating an intricate pattern of moisture that caught the afternoon light and seemed to shimmer with an almost otherworldly beauty. And Miss Marple, settling her knitting bag more securely on her arm, began the careful process of observation and deduction that had served her so well in the past, knowing with the certainty that comes from long experience that this afternoon's tragedy was merely the beginning of a mystery that would test all her considerable skills before it reached its resolution. The silence that followed Dr. Lake's collapse lasted perhaps 3 heartbeats before the drawing room erupted into those small, purposeful commotions that follow calamity. Dr. Haydock was on his knees beside the fallen man, his hands efficient and practiced, his face bearing the gravity of someone who had delivered unwelcome news too many times before. Mrs. Price Ridley pressed a handkerchief to her mouth and swayed with theatrical precision, while Colonel Brindley steadied her with the automatic gallantry of his military training. Mrs. Emmeline Drake began fussing with the curtains as though admitting more air might restore breath to a man whose breathing had undeniably ceased. Miss Marple, who had not moved at all during the commotion, observed the cut crystal jug of elderflower cordial and the arrangement of the remaining glasses with the methodical attention she might have given to a particularly intricate knitting pattern. There were 6 glasses set out, all of them old family crystal with delicate stems that would punish careless handling. The shattered glass around Dr. Lake's hand had broken rather than merely cracked, leaving a constellation of bright fragments that caught the afternoon light. The sweet scent of elderflower was now overlaid by something faint and bitter, and beneath that, the metallic tang that reminded her unpleasantly of certain garden chemicals, though she suspected its origin lay elsewhere entirely. "Nobody touch anything," Dr. Haydock commanded with quiet authority as he completed his examination, his voice carrying the weight of medical certainty. He looked up at the assembled guests with the expression of a man who had seen death in many forms. "I'm afraid Dr. Lake is gone, and given the circumstances, we must contact the police immediately. The symptoms suggest poisoning, though I cannot determine the specific agent without proper analysis." Sir Miles strode to the bell-pull with unnecessary force, his military bearing somewhat diminished by the domestic nature of this emergency. "The police, Merrick," he instructed when the butler appeared with suspicious promptness. "And keep the staff in the back corridor. No one is to leave the premises." Mrs. Rathbone set down the crystal jug with trembling hands, though Miss Marple noted that her fingers lingered on the handle as though reluctant to abandon the comfort of familiar tasks. The portrait of Lady Cecily continued its mysterious weeping with maddening composure. A second tear had gathered and fallen, catching on the painted curve of her cheek before tracing its deliberate path to her jawline. Miss Tamsin Reeve had moved closer to the canvas, too close perhaps, her gaze fixed not on the dead man but on the painting with an intensity that transcended mere artistic curiosity. "It's not possible," she whispered, barely audible, but Miss Marple heard, as she so often heard, the things not meant for general consumption. Inspector Slack arrived within the quarter hour, with the air of a man summoned from his teague and prepared to be methodical about his irritation. He listened to Dr. Haydock's crisp assessment, to Sir Miles's thunderous account, and to the nervous chatter of the assembled guests without allowing any of them to hasten his conclusions. He examined the jug and the remaining glasses, with the practiced eye of someone who had encountered poison in cheaper establishments than Larkspur Hall. Right then, Inspector Slack announced with his characteristic blend of efficiency and resignation, "No one goes home until we've had proper statements. Dr. Haydock, I'll want that cordial analyzed immediately." He glanced at Miss Marple with the brief nod of recognition that had developed between them over previous encounters with village mysteries. "And I suppose we'll need to discuss that weeping portrait as well. Tricks are sometimes played when folk want to pull attention away from more substantial matters." Through the subdued murmur of conversation that followed, Miss Marple's voice came mild and clear. "I wonder, Mrs. Rathbone, if the elderflower cordial was prepared this morning or perhaps yesterday. Such preparations can alter quite remarkably if they stand, particularly in warm weather." "Yesterday evening, Mrs. Pork," Rathbone replied quickly, her eyes darting between the inspector and the portrait. "Mrs. Sims made it from her grandmother's recipe. I decanted it myself this morning just before our guests arrived." Her voice carried the careful precision of someone who understood that every detail might now carry significance beyond mere social courtesy. Miss Marple settled more comfortably into her chair near the family photographs, from which vantage point she could observe both the continuing mystery of Lady Cecily's tears and the subtle shifts in expression that crossed each face as the reality of their situation began to settle upon them. The afternoon sun had shifted, casting longer shadows across the Persian carpet, and she noticed with interest that the room seemed unusually warm for such a day, as though some additional source of heat had been introduced to complement the modest fire crackling in the grate. Inspector Slack's methodical approach to the crime scene began with the immediate securing of all evidence, his practiced eye taking in the shattered crystal, the half-empty jug of elderflower cordial, and the continuing mystery of Lady Cecily's weeping portrait. He dispatched Constable Davies to ensure no one left the premises while summoning the police photographer, his manner suggesting a man who had encountered poison before and understood its particular demands on an investigation. Dr. Haydock supervised the careful collection of the cordial for laboratory analysis, though both men seemed puzzled by the portrait's persistent tears, which had now created an intricate pattern of moisture tracks down the painted cheek. Miss Marple, positioning herself strategically near the family photographs, where she could observe both the proceedings and the reactions of the assembled guests, noted with interest how the questioning began to reveal layers of information that had not been apparent during the social pleasantries of the afternoon. Mrs. Rathbone, when pressed about the cordial's preparation, explained with nervous precision that she had decanted it herself that morning from Mrs. Simms's earthenware jug into the family crystal service. The recipe was traditional, harmless, and had been served at countless gatherings without incident. The mystery of the weeping portrait found its explanation through Miss Tamsin Reeves' reluctant admission that she had brought a small electric heater to protect the painting from dampness. The device, positioned discreetly behind the chinoiserie screen near the fireplace, had created subtle air currents that, when combined with the restoration chemicals still present in the paint layers, had produced the condensation effect that so dramatically mimicked tears. Miss Marple observed with quiet satisfaction that this explanation, while scientifically sound, did nothing to diminish the unsettling atmosphere the phenomenon had created, nor did it explain the metallic scent that continued to permeate the room. More significant was the information that emerged about Dr. Lake's professional methods and the dangerous substances he had brought to Larkspur Hall. Mrs. Rathbone revealed that the restoration expert had worked with an impressive array of specialized chemicals, many of which he had warned were highly toxic. His equipment had been kept locked in the morning room each evening, and he had been particular about ventilation and safety protocols. The revelation that someone with both access to deadly substances and the knowledge to use them had been working in the house for 3 days cast the investigation in an entirely different light. Miss Marple's attention was drawn to the subtle behaviors that often revealed more than direct testimony. Miss Tamsin Reeves' paint-stained fingers remained clenched throughout the questioning, and her breathing became noticeably shallow whenever Dr. Lake's restoration work was mentioned. Mrs. Emmeline Drake, usually the first to offer observations and opinions, had become uncharacteristically quiet. Her position near the cordial service having given her an excellent view of events, she now seemed reluctant to discuss in detail. Inspector Slack's examination of the physical evidence proved methodical, but revealed troubling inconsistencies. The crystal jug showed no obvious signs of tampering, yet Miss Marple noted a faint ring of moisture on the silver tray where no glass had been placed, suggesting someone had moved vessels during the preparation. The shattered glass near Dr. Lake's body had broken with unusual force, creating a spray pattern that seemed inconsistent with a simple fall from nerveless fingers. As the formal statements continued, Mrs. Dolly Bantry appeared at Miss Marple's elbow with the irrepressible timing of someone who thrived on dramatic moments. Her whispered revelation proved particularly intriguing. Dr. Lake had apparently hinted at discoveries beneath the original paint layers, alterations to jewelry and other details that suggested Lady Cecily's portrait had been modified sometime after its completion. Such changes, Mrs. Bantry confided with obvious relish, often concealed family secrets that certain people preferred to remain buried. The afternoon shadows had grown longer, and the portrait continued its mysterious weeping despite Miss Reeves' technical explanation. Miss Marple found herself considering not just the obvious question of how poison had reached Dr. Lake's glass, but the more complex puzzle of why someone had chosen this particular moment, this particular gathering, to commit murder. The restoration expert's death had occurred at the precise moment when his work was being celebrated, suggesting that his discoveries, rather than his mere presence, had posed a threat someone could no longer tolerate. Inspector Slack closed his initial round of questioning with the grim efficiency of a man who understood that in cases of poison, the first hours were crucial for both evidence and truth. Yet Miss Marple sensed that the real investigation was only beginning, and that the weeping portrait, whatever its scientific explanation, had witnessed secrets that would require far more than laboratory analysis to uncover. Inspector Slack's methodical examination of the evidence had progressed from the immediate scene to the broader implications of Dr. Lake's presence at Larkspur Hall. The restoration expert's temporary laboratory in the morning room revealed not only the expected array of specialized chemicals and solvents, but also a leather portfolio containing detailed sketches and notes that cast the afternoon's tragedy in an entirely different light. Miss Marple, permitted to observe the proceedings due to her previous assistance in village matters, noted with particular interest the precision of Dr. Lake's documentation and the care with which he had recorded his discoveries. The portfolio contained meticulous drawings of Lady Cecily's jewelry as it appeared in various stages of the restoration process. What emerged was a fascinating record of deliberate alterations made to the original painting, changes that had been executed with considerable skill but were nonetheless detectable to an expert eye. The elaborate diamond parure originally depicted around Lady Cecily's throat had been painted over to show simple pearls, while a mourning brooch had been transformed into a cheerful spray of cornflowers. Most intriguingly, a locket that had once contained the miniature portrait of an infant had been altered to appear empty, though traces of the original painting remained beneath the surface layers. Mrs. Rathbone's reaction to these revelations provided Inspector Slack with his first clear indication that the portrait's secrets were connected to more than mere artistic curiosity. Her face had grown pale as Dr. Lake's notes were read aloud, and her hands trembled slightly as she attempted to maintain her composure. When pressed about the significance of these alterations, she admitted reluctantly that the family had indeed sold various pieces of antique jewelry in recent years to fund necessary repairs to the estate, though she insisted that all transactions had been conducted through legitimate channels. The investigation took on new dimensions when Miss Tamsin Reeve, perhaps recognizing that her involvement could no longer be concealed, revealed her true role in the recent events at Larkspur Hall. She had been commissioned not merely to provide artistic consultation, but to authenticate pieces of historical jewelry that Mrs. Rathbone had been attempting to sell through discreet collectors in London. Miss Reeve's expertise in period jewelry and her knowledge of provenance documentation had made her valuable to buyers who required absolute certainty about the legitimacy of their acquisitions. Inspector Slack's formal interviews, conducted in the library away from the unsettling presence of Lady Cecily's portrait, began to reveal the complex web of relationships and motivations that had brought the various parties together on this fatal afternoon. Mrs. Rathbone's account of the cordial's preparation remained consistent under questioning, but Miss Marple observed the subtle tension that appeared whenever the conversation touched on Dr. Lake's discoveries. The woman's distress seemed genuine, yet there was something calculated in the way she emphasized her constant presence and careful handling of the refreshments. Miss Reeve's interview proved equally revealing, though in ways that seemed to deepen rather than clarify the mystery. Her technical explanation for the portrait's weeping remained scientifically sound, yet her obvious familiarity with the painting's details suggested a level of involvement that went beyond professional consultation. When questioned about her relationship with Dr. Lake, she described their interactions as cordial but purely professional, though Miss Marple noted the way her fingers worried at traces of green paint beneath her nails, a shade that bore no resemblance to any colors visible in Lady Cecily's restored portrait. The physical evidence began to support a theory that the poison had been delivered through careful preparation rather than random contamination. Inspector Slack's examination of the drawing room revealed several troubling details that had been overlooked in the initial confusion. A faint ring of moisture on the silver tray suggested that a glass had been placed apart from the others, while one of the carefully arranged damask napkins was missing from the service. Most significantly, the pattern of crystal fragments around Dr. Lake's body indicated that the glass had shattered with unusual force, suggesting that its contents had been consumed rapidly and completely. Mrs. Sims, the cook, provided crucial testimony about the preparation and security of the elderflower. Cordial. Her account confirmed that the syrup had been prepared according to traditional methods the previous evening, and that the crystal service had been arranged that morning without interference from anyone outside the household staff. However, her mention of a discarded napkin found in the scullery bin, bearing traces of an acrid scent that bore no resemblance to elderflower, provided Inspector Slack with his first concrete evidence that someone had indeed tampered with the refreshments. Miss Marple's quiet observations during these proceedings focused less on the formal testimony than on the subtle behaviors and reactions that often revealed more than direct questioning. She noted Mrs. Emmeline Drake's nervous habit of polishing her silver buttons, Colonel Brindley's tendency to glance repeatedly toward the French windows, and Dr. Haydock's obvious impatience with the proceedings. Most intriguingly, she observed that several of the guests seemed less shocked by Dr. Lake's death than by the revelations about the portrait's alterations, suggesting that the restoration expert's discoveries had posed a more immediate threat than his mere presence. As the afternoon shadows lengthened and the formal investigation continued, the emerging picture suggested a crime that had been planned with considerable sophistication. The murderer had not only possessed the knowledge and opportunity to prepare a poisoned glass specifically for Dr. Lake, but had also anticipated the need to conceal their actions amid the social confusion of the afternoon's gathering. The weeping portrait, whether scientifically explained or not, had provided the perfect distraction at the crucial moment, drawing attention away from the careful substitution that had delivered death in a crystal glass. The revelation that Dr. Lake's restoration work had uncovered evidence of insurance fraud, inheritance disputes, or other financial irregularities provided multiple motives for murder. Yet Miss Marple found herself considering not just who had the opportunity and means to commit the crime, but who possessed the particular combination of knowledge, desperation, and cold calculation necessary to plan and execute such a methodical killing. The answer, she suspected, lay not in the obvious connections between the various suspects, but in the hidden relationships and secret motivations that had brought them all together on this seemingly innocent afternoon. The acrid scent clinging to the discarded napkin provided Inspector Slack with his first concrete evidence of deliberate preparation, though the implications proved more complex than a simple case of chemical contamination. Dr. Haydock's preliminary examination suggested the fabric had been used to clean something containing traces of restoration solvents, but the pattern of residue indicated careful wiping rather than accidental spillage. Miss Marple, observing the proceedings with her characteristic attention to domestic details, noted that the napkin bore the particular fold marks that came from being pressed into service for an unintended purpose, quite different from the crisp creases of proper table linen. Her gentle inquiries among the household staff revealed a fascinating sequence of small disruptions to the morning's routine that had passed unnoticed in the general preparation for the afternoon's gathering. Mrs. Sims confirmed that the elderflower cordial had been prepared according to her grandmother's recipe the previous evening, using only the finest ingredients and traditional methods. However, Merrick's testimony about the crystal service proved particularly illuminating when Miss Marple's careful questions revealed that he had briefly left the tray unattended on the drawing-room sideboard while returning to the pantry for cleaner sugar tongs. During that brief absence, someone had indeed approached the refreshment table, leaving behind the telltale ring of moisture that suggested a glass had been temporarily placed apart from the others. Merrick's observation that the arrangement had been subtly altered, with the glasses shifted perhaps an inch or two from their original positions, took on new significance when considered alongside the family's long-standing custom of offering the leftmost glass to the guest of honor. Miss Marple reflected that such traditions, while charming in their consistency, also provided a murderer with the precise predictability necessary for targeted poisoning. Inspector Slack's examination of Dr. Lake's temporary laboratory in the morning room revealed troubling gaps in the security of the dangerous chemicals the restoration expert had brought to Larkspur Hall. While Dr. Lake had indeed locked his equipment each evening, the key had been kept in the library desk drawer, a location that would have been familiar to anyone with regular access to the house. More disturbing was the discovery that one of the small bottles containing concentrated solvents showed evidence of recent handling, despite Dr. Lake's meticulous notes indicating that particular chemical had not been required for the portrait restoration work. The investigation took an unexpected turn when Colonel Brindley, who had maintained his characteristic military reserve throughout the initial questioning, approached Inspector Slack with information that cast the morning's events in an entirely different light. He revealed that approximately an hour before the unveiling ceremony, he had observed Miss Tamsin Reeve in what appeared to be a heated discussion with Dr. Lake near the French windows. Their conversation, conducted in urgent whispers, had ended with Miss Reeve walking away with obvious agitation, while Dr. Lake remained staring thoughtfully at the shrouded portrait, his expression troubled. Miss Marple's attention was particularly drawn to the implications of this revelation when combined with her earlier observation of the fresh green paint beneath Miss Reeve's fingernails. The color bore no resemblance to any pigments visible in Lady Cecily's portrait, yet it appeared to have been applied that very morning. When questioned more directly about her relationship with Dr. Lake, Miss Reeve's initial claims of purely professional interaction began to show signs of strain, and she eventually admitted to discussions about a potential business partnership that would have provided her with exclusive authentication work throughout the county. The discovery of a small painted fragment in the scullery bin, retrieved along with a contaminated napkin, provided the most startling revelation of the afternoon's investigation. The scrap, no larger than a postage stamp and curled at the edges from exposure to both moisture and heat, bore traces of the distinctive blue and gold pigments that Dr. Lake had documented in his detailed drawings of the portrait's original state. When compared to his sketches of Lady Cecily's locket before its alteration, the fragment appeared to contain part of the miniature portrait of an infant that had been painted over in the family's attempt to conceal some long-buried secret. Mrs. Rathbone's reaction to this discovery confirmed Inspector Slack's growing suspicion that the portrait's alterations were connected to more than mere artistic preference. Her face grew pale as the implications became clear, and her carefully maintained composure began to show signs of genuine distress. The revelation that someone had not only accessed Dr. Lake's restoration chemicals, but had also attempted to destroy evidence of the portrait's original contents, suggested a level of desperation that went far beyond concerns about insurance fraud or estate finances. Miss Marple found herself considering the particular combination of knowledge, opportunity, and cold calculation that would have been required to plan and execute such a methodical crime. The murderer had not only possessed intimate familiarity with the household routines and the family's customs regarding hospitality, but had also demonstrated sophisticated understanding of both the toxic properties of restoration chemicals and the precise timing necessary to deliver poison at the moment of maximum distraction. The weeping portrait, whatever its scientific explanation, had provided the perfect theatrical element to draw attention away from the careful substitution that had delivered death in a crystal glass. As the shadows lengthened across the drawing room and the formal investigation continued, a sudden commotion in the corridor shattered the tense quiet that had settled over Larkspur Hall. Constable Davis's sharp shout brought everyone to their feet as the morning room door, which had been left slightly ajar, swung open to reveal that Dr. Lake's leather portfolio containing his detailed documentation of the portrait's secrets had vanished from the table where it had been carefully preserved as evidence. The theft, executed with brazen efficiency, while the household was occupied with formal statements, confirmed that the murderer was not content merely to have silenced Dr. Lake, but was actively working to eliminate any trace of the discoveries that had prompted the afternoon's deadly events. Miss Marple observed the faces of the assembled suspects as the reality of this new development sank in, noting with particular interest that the theft seemed to produce less surprise than relief in certain quarters. The missing portfolio represented not just evidence, but the culmination of weeks of careful research that someone was determined to suppress at any cost. The question that remained was which of the afternoon's guests possessed both the desperation and the intimate knowledge of Larkspur Hall necessary to move through the house undetected while the police investigation continued in the adjacent rooms. The theft of Dr. Lake's portfolio galvanized Inspector Slack into immediate action, his methodical demeanor sharpening into something approaching military efficiency. Within minutes, he had secured all exits and dispatched Constable Davies to conduct a systematic search of the premises, while the assembled guests found themselves confined to the drawing room under watchful supervision. Miss Marple observed with quiet interest how this development affected each person differently, noting that some displayed genuine alarm while others seemed to settle into their chairs with what might have been resignation or perhaps calculated patience. The search revealed troubling evidence of hasty activity throughout Larkspur Hall. Inspector Slack's examination of the French windows uncovered a pale graze in the paint and a telling smear on the curtain hem, suggesting someone had used this route during the confusion following Dr. Lake's death. More significantly, the fern fronds by the window showed signs of recent disturbance, and Miss Marple noted with particular interest that Miss Tamsin Reeves' neat shoes bore a filament of fern, bruised and wet against the leather, providing the first concrete evidence of unauthorized movement. The morning room yielded additional clues that painted a picture of desperate improvisation rather than careful planning. A second contaminated napkin, hidden beneath the window seat cushions, bore the same acrid chemical residue as the first, but also showed impressions of text that suggested it had been used to handle documents. The discovery that several bottles of Dr. Lake's restoration chemicals were missing from his locked laboratory added a sinister dimension to the investigation, particularly when Dr. Haydock confirmed that one absent substance was potassium cyanide, a restorer's traditional tool that could prove deadly in sweet cordial. Mrs. Rathbone's revelation about the house's network of servant passages provided a plausible explanation for how the theft had been accomplished undetected. These corridors, still occasionally used during large gatherings, connected the main rooms to the kitchen and service areas, allowing someone familiar with the house's architecture to move about without attracting notice. Miss Marple filed this information alongside her growing catalogue of domestic details that others had overlooked, including the disappearance of a small lavender sachet from the library's marquetry cabinet, the sort of trifle one might use to disguise odors in a hastily concealed leather portfolio. The investigation took an unexpected turn when Inspector Slack discovered evidence of the thief's hurried attempts at concealment. The piano in the drawing room bore fresh fingerprints on its fallboard, and examination of the stool's compartment revealed a rectangular absence in the accumulated dust, though the hiding place now contained only old programs and dried heather. More significantly, the fireplace grate held feathery ash from recent burning, and careful examination with a poker recovered a ragged corner of cartridge paper bearing the ghost of a sketched curl and a dot of ultramarine pigment. Mrs. Emmeline Drake's behavior during these discoveries provided Miss Marple with additional cause for reflection. The woman, who usually offered observations and opinions with generous enthusiasm, had become uncharacteristically quiet, her nervous habit of polishing her silver buttons replaced by rigid stillness. Mrs. Dolly Bantry's whispered intelligence about Mrs. Drake's discreet dealings with London collectors added another layer to the emerging picture of village secrets and hidden transactions. Sir Miles's admission that the portrait restoration had been commissioned in preparation for a lucrative sale to an American collector cast the afternoon's events in an entirely different light. The family's financial difficulties were more severe than initially admitted, and Dr. Lake's documentation had been essential to completing the transaction. The theft had effectively destroyed not only crucial evidence, but also the Rathbone family's hopes of financial salvation, creating multiple motives for desperate action. Miss Marple found herself considering the particular combination of knowledge, desperation, and opportunity that would have been required for both the murder and the subsequent theft. The perpetrator had demonstrated intimate familiarity with the house's routines and architecture, sophisticated understanding of toxic substances, and the nerve to act under police surveillance. Most tellingly, they had shown a willingness to escalate their crimes when the initial murder proved insufficient to protect their secrets. As evening shadows lengthened across the drawing room, the portrait of Lady Cecily continued its mysterious weeping, though the tears now seemed less supernatural than prophetic. The missing portfolio represented more than evidence. It contained discoveries that someone had killed, suppressed, and stolen to destroy. Yet the very audacity of the theft suggested that the murderer was now improvising rather than following a predetermined plan, raising the troubling possibility that the afternoon's violence might not yet be concluded. Miss Marple settled more comfortably into her observation post, recognizing that the stakes continued to escalate with each passing hour, and that the solution to this puzzle lay not in the grand gestures of murder and theft, but in the accumulations of small, seemingly insignificant details that revealed the human heart in all its complexity. Inspector Slack's response to the portfolio theft demonstrated the methodical efficiency that had served him well in previous investigations, though the audacity of committing a second crime under active police surveillance suggested a level of desperation that made the perpetrator increasingly dangerous. His decision to explore the servant passages with Sir Miles and Constable Davies proved immediately fruitful, as the narrow corridors revealed evidence of recent, hurried activity that had gone unnoticed during the afternoon's confusion. Miss Marple, positioning herself strategically near the green baize door that connected the main house to the service areas, found that her knitting provided the perfect excuse for remaining stationary, while her keen ears catalogued the sounds of investigation echoing through the hidden arteries of Larkspur Hall. The passages themselves told a story of hasty movement and careful concealment, their dusty floors bearing the telltale scuff marks of someone unfamiliar with their layout, yet desperate enough to risk navigation in near darkness. Inspector Slack's torch beam revealed a smear of green paint on the handrail at hip height, the color unmistakably modern and bearing the distinctive chrome-yellow undertone that Miss Marple had observed beneath Miss Tamsin Reeves' fingernails. More significantly, the old still room at the passage's terminus showed clear signs of recent occupation, its long disused door standing ajar, and its interior bearing the lingering scent of lavender and something far more acrid. The discovery of Dr. Lake's portfolio, remnants in the still room's recessed cupboard, provided both answers and new mysteries that deepened the investigation's complexity. The leather case had been systematically destroyed, its contents burned in a makeshift brazier fashioned from an old preserving pan, though the perpetrator's haste had left crucial evidence intact. Among the ashes, Inspector Slack recovered fragments of the restoration expert's detailed sketches and correspondence, including a partially burned letter from a London insurance investigator that mentioned irregularities in claims filed during the 1920s. Most tellingly, a glass stopper from one of Dr. Lake's chemical bottles lay wrapped in a delicate handkerchief bearing an embroidered letter C, the monogram executed in the expensive silk thread that spoke of wealth and careful maintenance. The investigation took a violent turn when Constable Davies, reaching for what appeared to be additional evidence behind a loose panel, was struck by a makeshift weapon that had been rigged as a trap for unwary searchers. The brass doorstop, recently unscrewed from its proper location and suspended on a length of picture wire, caught the constable across the temple with sufficient force to draw blood and leave him dazed. The attack demonstrated not only the perpetrator's intimate knowledge of the house's architecture, but also their willingness to escalate violence to protect their secrets, suggesting that Dr. Lake's murder had been merely the first step in a more comprehensive plan to eliminate threats to their carefully constructed deception. Mrs. Rathbone's reaction to the discovery of the monogrammed handkerchief provided Inspector Slack with his clearest indication yet that the crimes were rooted in family secrets that extended far beyond mere financial irregularities. Her carefully maintained composure finally showed signs of strain as she attempted to explain the presence of her personal linen in such compromising circumstances, her suggestions about laundry confusion and county coincidences failing to convince anyone present. The handkerchief's placement, wrapped around evidence of chemical tampering and hidden in a location that required intimate knowledge of the house's hidden spaces, spoke of deliberate concealment rather than innocent mislaying. Miss Marple's gentle observations about the family photographs displayed throughout the drawing room began to reveal connections that others had overlooked in their focus on the immediate crimes. Her seemingly innocent comments about christenings and family timing drew attention to a sepia portrait of a nursemaid holding an infant with remarkably dark eyes, a detail that took on new significance when considered alongside Dr. Lake's documentation of the altered locket in Lady Cecily's portrait. The pattern of modifications to the painting, she suggested with characteristic understatement, often reflected family efforts to obscure inconvenient truths about lineage and legitimacy, matters that could destroy social standing and financial prospects across multiple generations. The escalating nature of the crimes, from murder through theft to physical assault, demonstrated a level of desperation that suggested the perpetrator was now improvising rather than following a carefully planned strategy. The makeshift trap that had injured Constable Davies bore the hallmarks of someone working under extreme pressure, using whatever materials came to hand, rather than employing the sophisticated preparation that had characterized Dr. Lake's poisoning. Miss Marple reflected that such deteriorations in criminal methodology often preceded either capture or final, desperate attempt to eliminate all remaining threats to the carefully guarded secret that had motivated the afternoon's violence. As evening shadows lengthened across Larkspur Hall and the portrait of Lady Cecily continued its mysterious weeping, the investigation had revealed a web of deception that extended far beyond the simple art authentication fraud that had initially seemed to motivate the crimes. The evidence suggested a conspiracy involving insurance fraud, forged documentation, and family secrets that someone was willing to kill repeatedly to protect. The question that remained was which of the afternoon's guests possessed not only the knowledge and opportunity to commit the crimes, but also the particular combination of desperation and cold calculation necessary to escalate from murder to assault while maintaining the facade of shocked innocence that had characterized their public behavior throughout the investigation. The evening shadows that crept across Larkspur Hall seemed to carry with them an atmosphere of barely contained menace. As Inspector Slack ordered additional lamps lit throughout the drawing room and posted guards at every entrance. The attack on Constable Davies had transformed what had been a methodical investigation into something approaching a siege, with the remaining suspects now confined under watchful supervision, while the perpetrator's escalating desperation made further violence an imminent possibility. Miss Marple accepted a cup of weak tea from Merrick's nervous service, noting how the butler's usually steady hands trembled slightly as he navigated between the assembled guests, each of whom now regarded their companions with the wary calculation of people who understood that a murderer remained among them. Inspector Slack's systematic examination of the drawing room revealed evidence that someone had been making increasingly desperate attempts to access secrets that Dr. Lake's restoration work had brought dangerously close to exposure. Near the portrait's ornate frame, Miss Marple's keen eyes discovered a crumb of sealing wax, deep carmine flecked with gold, the sort used for old family documents, along with a thread of aged linen that bore the stiff textures of fabric long stored in undisturbed drawers. The placement of these items suggested someone had been working hastily near Lady Cecily's portrait, perhaps attempting to retrieve or conceal something of crucial importance to their carefully guarded secret. The investigation took a violent turn when a sharp cry from the direction of the portrait drew everyone's attention to a deliberate act of vandalism that spoke of pure desperation. Someone had used a thin blade to make a careful incision around the painted locket at Lady Cecily's throat, the cut precise yet abandoned as though the perpetrator had been startled in their work. Inspector Slack's immediate search of the area revealed a silver button bearing the decorative rope edge that Mrs. Emmeline Drake had been nervously polishing throughout the afternoon, while examination of the portrait's backing disclosed a small lavender sachet that had been wedged between the canvas and stretcher, its presence explaining the subtle floral scent that had puzzled observers earlier. Mrs. Dr. Drake's reaction to the discovery of her button provided the clearest indication yet of her involvement in the afternoon's escalating crimes. Her characteristic nervous energy had given way to a brittle stillness that spoke of someone calculating each word before speaking, while her usual eagerness to offer opinions and observations had been replaced by watchful silence. When pressed about her knowledge of the family's financial difficulties and their dealings with London collectors, her responses became evasive in ways that suggested personal involvement rather than mere village gossip, though her obvious fear seemed to stem from consequences rather than guilt. Dr. Haydock's analysis of the chemical evidence revealed troubling connections between Dr. Lake's restoration work and the method of his murder. Traces of shellac had been detected not only in the cordial remnants, but also on the rim of the fatal glass and on a teaspoon, suggesting that someone with intimate knowledge of restoration techniques had used professional materials to mask the bitter taste of cyanide. The sophistication of this approach, combined with the perpetrator's demonstrated knowledge of the house's hidden passages and family customs, pointed to someone whose involvement extended far beyond opportunistic crime into the realm of carefully planned elimination of threats to long-buried secrets. Miss Marple observed these developments with the quiet attention that had served her well in previous encounters with human nature at its most desperate and calculating. The escalation from murder through theft to physical assault and now vandalism demonstrated someone who had committed themselves to a course of action that demanded constant improvisation as circumstances spiraled beyond their control. The portrait of Lady Cecily continued its mysterious weeping as the investigation entered what Miss Marple recognized as its most critical phase, the painted tears now seeming less like supernatural intervention than like a commentary on the human capacity for self-destruction in the service of protecting secrets that were often less damaging than the crimes committed to conceal them. As the evening deepened and the assembled suspects settled into an uneasy vigil, Miss Marple began the careful preparation for the psychological approach that would be necessary to extract the final truth from someone who had already proven willing to kill repeatedly, rather than face exposure of whatever family scandal Dr. Lake's restoration work had threatened to reveal. The uneasy quiet that settled over the drawing room as evening deepened provided Miss Marple with precisely the atmosphere she required for the delicate psychological work that remained. She observed the assembled company with the practiced eye of someone who had spent decades watching human nature reveal itself under pressure, noting how the additional lamplight seemed to cast sharper shadows, not only across the Persian carpet, but across the faces of those who had spent the afternoon concealing their true relationships to the afternoon's tragic events. Her knitting needles resumed their gentle rhythm as she positioned herself where she could observe both the damaged portrait and the subtle interplay of glances and gestures that spoke more eloquently than any formal testimony. Inspector Slack's methodical approach had assembled an impressive collection of physical evidence, yet Miss Marple understood that the solution to this particular puzzle lay not in chemical analysis or forensic examination, but in the careful observation of human behavior under the precise pressure that only the right words, delivered with apparent innocence, could provide. She began with seemingly casual observations about the fascinating details that restoration work often revealed about family history. her voice carrying the gentle authority of someone discussing the weather or the church flower arrangements, though her pale blue eyes missed nothing of the reactions her words produced. Her commentary about the techniques used to conceal family secrets in portraiture drew immediate and telling responses from the assembled suspects. Mrs. Rathbone's carefully maintained composure showed signs of strain as Miss Marple discussed the alterations to Lady Cecily's painted locket, while Mrs. Emmeline Drake's nervous energy had given way to a watchful stillness that spoke of someone calculating each word before speaking. Miss Tamsin Reeve sat with rigid attention, her paint-stained fingers clenched in her lap, her gaze fixed on the damaged portrait with an intensity that transcended mere professional interest in the vandalism that had been committed. Miss Marple's gentle inquiries about the green paint beneath Miss Reeve's fingernails prompted a reaction that revealed far more than the young woman intended. Her explanation about preparing materials for future restoration work rang hollow when considered alongside the sophisticated knowledge of household routines and chemical processes that the afternoon's crimes had demonstrated. The revelation that she had been working with pigments that bore no resemblance to those used in Lady Cecily's portrait suggested involvement in projects that extended beyond legitimate restoration into areas that someone had been willing to kill to protect. The psychological pressure of Miss Marple's seemingly innocent observations about art authentication and the methods used by professional forgers to create convincing provenance documentation finally began to produce the reactions she had been carefully orchestrating. Mrs. Drake's obvious familiarity with the technical aspects of document aging and her demonstrated knowledge of London collectors became increasingly difficult to reconcile with her claimed role as a simple village shopkeeper, while her nervous habit of polishing her silver buttons had given way to a brittle stillness that suggested someone fighting to maintain control over increasingly desperate circumstances. Miss Marple's discussion of the family photographs and their implications for understanding the portrait's alterations created an atmosphere of mounting tension that affected each suspect differently. Mrs. Rathbone's protective instincts regarding family secrets became more pronounced as the conversation touched on matters of legitimacy and inheritance, while Miss Reeve's professional knowledge of forgery techniques became harder to disguise as mere academic interest. Most significantly, Mrs. Drake's reactions to discussions of authentication, fraud, and insurance manipulation revealed connections that extended far beyond casual village gossip into the realm of personal involvement in sophisticated criminal enterprises. The evening shadows that crept across Larkspur Hall seemed to carry with them the weight of secrets that could no longer be contained by the careful facades that had protected them throughout the afternoon's investigation. Miss Marple's gentle but relentless questioning had created a web of psychological pressure that was beginning to produce the cracks in composure that she recognized as the precursors to confession or desperate action. The portrait of Lady Cecily continued its mysterious weeping, the painted tears now seeming to comment on the human capacity for self-destruction in the service of protecting secrets that were often less damaging than the crimes committed to conceal them. As the mantelpiece clock chimed the quarter hour, Miss Marple observed the subtle shifts in posture and expression that indicated the approaching climax of the psychological drama she had been carefully orchestrating. The accumulated weight of evidence, combined with the mounting pressure of her seemingly innocent observations, had created a situation where someone would soon be forced to choose between confession and a final, desperate attempt to eliminate the remaining threats to their carefully guarded secrets. The question that remained was whether that choice would lead to the peaceful resolution of the mystery, or to the escalation of violence that had already claimed one life and threatened to claim more before the evening's work was complete. The drawing room fell into an expectant silence as Miss Marple set aside her knitting and fixed her pale blue eyes on the assembled company with the gentle but implacable authority of someone who had arrived at the truth through patient observation and careful deduction. The moment had come for the final revelation that would expose not only the identity of Dr. Lake's murderer, But the complex web of deception and desperation that had made such a crime seemed necessary to someone who had already traveled too far down a path of escalating criminality to turn back without facing the consequences of their carefully concealed actions. The expectant silence that settled over the drawing room carried with it the weight of accumulated secrets and the promise of revelations that would finally illuminate the complex web of deception that had culminated in Dr. Lake's murder. Miss Marple set aside her knitting with deliberate care, her pale blue eyes moving thoughtfully from face to face with the gentle but implacable authority of someone who had arrived at the truth through patient observation and careful deduction. When she spoke, her voice held the quiet certainty that had served her well in previous encounters with human nature at its most desperate and calculating. "I find myself thinking," Miss Marple began with characteristic understatement, "about customs and traditions and how they can become so very dangerous when observed by those who wish to do harm. The leftmost glass is always offered to the guest of honor at Larkspur Hall, a charming tradition that requires only modest foresight from a determined person to ensure that Dr. Lake would receive a particular glass, prepared for him alone." Her voice remained mild, almost conversational, though Inspector Slack's pencil had stilled completely as he recognized the approaching revelation. She continued with observations about the technical sophistication required for the crime, noting how cyanide's bitter taste had been cleverly masked by shellac, a substance that possessed the necessary sweetness to make the poison palatable when dissolved in elderflower cordial. The traces found on the rim of the shattered glass and on a teaspoon provided evidence of careful preparation, while the ring of moisture on the silver tray indicated where an extra glass had been placed temporarily during the crucial substitution that had delivered death with such precision. Miss Marple's attention turned to the portrait itself and the discoveries that had made Dr. Lake's murder seem necessary to someone desperate to protect long-buried secrets. Dr. Lake's restoration work revealed alterations that spoke of more than artistic preference, she observed gently. The locket at Lady Cecily's throat had once contained the miniature portrait of an infant, painted over sometime during the 1820s to conceal what the family considered an inconvenient truth about lineage and legitimacy. Such secrets, when they threaten both social standing and financial survival, can drive people to extraordinary measures. The significance of these alterations became clear when considered alongside the family's current financial difficulties and the crucial importance of the portrait's sale to American collectors. Dr. Lake's documentation had threatened not only to expose the century-old scandal, but to invalidate the authentication that made the sale possible, destroying the Rathbone family's last hope of financial salvation. Miss Marple's systematic presentation of the physical evidence created an increasingly compelling case that pointed to someone with intimate knowledge of both the household routines and Dr. Lake's restoration materials. The monogrammed handkerchief found wrapped around a chemical stopper in the still room bore the distinctive embroidery style that marked it as belonging to the lady of the house, while its placement in a location accessible only through the servant passages indicated someone with complete familiarity with Larkspur Hall's hidden architecture. The green paint traces that had appeared throughout the crime scenes told their own story of hasty movement and desperate concealment, while the sophisticated knowledge required to combine restoration chemicals into an effective poison spoke of someone who had observed Dr. Lake's work with careful attention to detail. The theft of the portfolio and the subsequent vandalism of the portrait itself represented escalating attempts to eliminate evidence that could no longer be suppressed through more subtle means. "Mrs. Rathbone," Miss Marple said gently, her gaze settling on the woman whose carefully maintained composure had been showing increasing signs of strain throughout the investigation, "you had every opportunity to observe Dr. Lake's methods during his 3 days of work at Larkspur Hall. You prepared the elderflower cordial yourself, decanting it from Mrs. Simms's earthenware jug into the family crystal service. You knew of Merrick's brief absence to fetch cleaner sugar tongs, and you understood the household tradition that would ensure Dr. Lake received the leftmost glass as the guest of honor. the revelation that Mrs. Rathbone had possessed the keys to Dr. Lake's laboratory, kept in the library desk drawer according to his security protocols, provided the final piece of the puzzle regarding access to the deadly chemicals that had made the murder possible. Her intimate knowledge of the house's servant passages had allowed her to move undetected during the theft of the portfolio and the subsequent attempt to destroy evidence in the still room. Miss Marple's gentle exposition revealed the crushing weight of circumstances that had driven Mrs. Rathbone to such desperate measures. The portrait's sale represented the family's last chance to avoid complete financial ruin, while Dr. Lake's discoveries threatened to expose not only insurance fraud from the 1920s, but also the fundamental question of legitimacy that could destroy generations of carefully maintained social standing. The combination of immediate financial necessity and the protection of family honor had created a situation where murder seemed preferable to exposure. As Miss Marple's careful reconstruction reached its conclusion, the assembled company watched Mrs. Rathbone's face transform from carefully maintained dignity to the terrible recognition that her carefully guarded secrets could no longer be protected. The woman who had presided over countless social gatherings with gracious efficiency now sat with trembling hands, her pale blue eyes reflecting the desperate calculation of someone who understood that the game was finally over. The crude incision around the painted locket, Miss Marple observed with gentle finality, was your last desperate attempt to physically remove the evidence that Dr. Lake's restoration had brought so dangerously close to exposure. But some secrets, once disturbed, cannot be buried again through violence or deception. Mrs. Rathbone's confession, when it came, carried the quiet dignity of someone who had exhausted all alternatives and recognized the futility of further resistance. She had killed Dr. Lake to protect her family's name and their last chance at financial survival, but the escalating crimes that followed had only hastened the exposure she had sought so desperately to prevent. Inspector Slack's handcuffs closed with quiet finality as the portrait of Lady Cecily, her mysterious tears now ceased in the cooling evening air, seemed to release the room from the spell of secrets that had claimed one life and destroyed another. The drawing-room settled into the profound quiet that follows the resolution of long-held mysteries, while Miss Marple retrieved her knitting bag with the satisfied air of someone who had once again witnessed the triumph of patient observation over the most carefully constructed deceptions that human desperation could devise. The silence that followed Mrs. Rathbone's confession settled over Larkspur Hall like dust after a storm, heavy with the weight of revealed secrets and shattered illusions. Inspector Slack conducted her from the drawing-room with professional courtesy, the click of handcuffs echoing with finality through the elegant space that had witnessed such careful social rituals, transformed into the theater of murder. Sir Miles remained standing by the mantelpiece, his military bearing diminished by the crushing realization that his wife's desperate crimes had been committed in service of protecting a family secret that no longer possessed the power to destroy them. The complete resolution of the mystery revealed the tragic irony that had driven Mrs. Rathbone to such elaborate deception. The family secret concealed beneath Lady Cecily's altered portrait proved far less scandalous than the crimes committed to protect it. The illegitimate child, whose miniature portrait had been painted over in the 1820s, had been acknowledged by the family and raised with dignity, eventually inheriting a modest competence that had supported several generations of descendants. The alterations had been made not to conceal shame, but to protect the child's heirs from social prejudices that had long since lost their sting, while the insurance irregularities of the 1920s had been minor adjustments to valuations that modern collectors would have regarded as standard practice. Most devastating of all was Inspector Slack's revelation that the American collector who had commissioned the portrait's restoration had been primarily interested in its artistic merit rather than its pristine provenance. The sale could have proceeded even with full knowledge of Dr. Lake's discoveries, providing the financial salvation the Rathbones desperately needed through honest disclosure rather than murder. Mrs. Rathbone's sophisticated knowledge of restoration techniques, gained through years of observing experts work on the family collection, had provided her with the means to commit murder with chemical precision. Yet her elaborate planning had been rendered unnecessary by circumstances she had been too frightened to investigate. The fates of the secondary participants in the afternoon's tragedy unfolded with the inexorable logic that follows the exposure of long-concealed deceptions. Miss Tamsin Reeve faced professional ruin and likely criminal charges for her role in creating forged documentation for the family's discreet sales to London collectors, her artistic talents perverted into the service of authentication fraud. Mrs. Emmeline Drake, whose nervous energy had finally been explained by her involvement in the network of questionable transactions, would face lesser charges for evidence tampering and conspiracy, though her cooperation with the investigation might earn some consideration from the courts. Sir Miles, his dreams of financial salvation and restored family honor crumbling around him, provided the missing details of his wife's escalating desperation with the resigned dignity of a man who understood that concealment was no longer possible. The portrait would never reach its intended buyer, and Larkspur Hall would indeed contract into fewer rooms as the family learned to live within the truth that Mrs. Rathbone had killed to avoid. The estate that had hosted elegant gatherings under crystal chandeliers would now struggle with reduced circumstances, though Sir Miles faced this prospect with the stoic acceptance of a soldier who had survived worse defeats than financial ruin. The portrait of Lady Cecily, its mysterious weeping, finally ceased now that Miss Reeve's heating apparatus had been removed and the windows opened to the cooling evening air, seemed to gaze upon the aftermath of the afternoon's tragedy with painted serenity that felt almost reproachful. The tears that had provided such dramatic punctuation to Dr. Lake's murder had been nothing more than the natural response of old varnishes to artificial heating. Yet their timing had created an atmosphere of supernatural intervention that would become part of village folklore for generations to come. Miss Marple accepted Dr. Haydock's offer of a ride home through the familiar lanes of St. Mary Mead, her knitting bag containing the beginnings of yet another pair of mittens as her needles resumed their gentle rhythm. The village would recover from the scandal, as villages always do, she reflected, though the story of the weeping portrait and the restoration expert's murder would enrich the texture of local legend. Mrs. Price Ridley would find endless material for Women's Institute discussions, while Mrs. Bantry would report with relish that the portrait's tears had stopped entirely once the artificial heating was removed. As her cottage came into view, Miss Marple considered the afternoon's events with the philosophical acceptance that had sustained her through previous encounters with human nature at its most complex and contradictory. The tragedy at Larkspur Hall had demonstrated once again that the most elaborate crimes often arose from the simplest human failings, and that the secrets people killed to protect were frequently far less damaging than the violence committed in their name. Mrs. Rathbone's escalating crimes, from murder through theft to assault and vandalism, had been driven by a combination of financial desperation and misplaced family pride that had transformed a manageable difficulty into a catastrophe that claimed one life and destroyed her own. Settling into her familiar armchair as evening shadows lengthened across her sitting room, Miss Marple reflected on the human capacity for self-deception that so often proved more dangerous than any external threat. The gentle click of her knitting needles provided a comforting counterpoint to the evening quiet, while outside her cottage window, the eternal rhythms of village life continued their cycle of renewal and hope. She had witnessed justice served and truth revealed, even in circumstances where both had seemed impossible to achieve, and that knowledge brought the quiet satisfaction that came from understanding that patience and careful observation could illuminate even the most carefully constructed deceptions. The mystery of the weeping portrait had been solved through methodical investigation and gentle psychological pressure, though the human mysteries it had revealed would continue to resonate through the lives of all who had been touched by the afternoon's tragic events. Miss Marple completed another row of stitches and smiled with the serene confidence of someone who had once again seen truth triumph over elaborately constructed lies, knowing that in St. Mary Mead, as everywhere else, human nature would continue to provide endless variations on the eternal themes of love, greed, pride, and the terrible prices people paid when they chose deceptions over the sometimes painful honesty that might have saved them all.